If you've got your Bibles, and I hope you do, would you grab them and open them up to the passage that was read over us, Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27 is where we're going to be. You can open a phone or a tablet to Matthew chapter 27. We'll be reading from the English Standard Version. If you grabbed one of those hardback black Bibles on the ledges, you can find Matthew 27 on page 834. But Matthew 27 is where we're going to spend our time. In Matthew 27, the section that we're looking at today, for the first time, we have Jesus Christ not before the religious establishment, but actually before the political establishment of Rome. So let me catch you up to where we are, okay? In chapter 26, a few weeks ago, one of our elders, Eric, taught us about Jesus, the beginning of Jesus' trial after he is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that beginning part of his trial is he's being tried by what's known as the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin are the Jewish religious leaders, the high priests and the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They make up the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body of the religious side of things. So Eric taught us that. And then we took a week and the camera panned over to Peter in this courtyard as Jesus is on trial. And so we talked about Peter. And then last week, the camera panned over to Judas. And Judas tried to undo all that he had done, right? He tried to give back the 50 pieces of silver. He was very remorseful that he had betrayed Jesus, but it to no avail. It did not play out the way that he wanted it to. And now the camera zooms back. So the camera was on Jesus in his trial, then to Peter, then to Judas, and now the camera pans back to Jesus. But what we see here is the trial of Jesus. It's now Friday morning. So the evening has passed. It's the morning of Friday, Good Friday. Okay, and all of the religious leaders of the Jews have now brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate. You know that name, Pontius Pilate. He is the Roman governor of Judea during the reign of the second emperor of Rome, the Emperor Tiberius. And what I want you to do with me today in the text is to understand our text. We need to do some work to understand the workings of both the Jewish court system of the time and the Roman court system of the time. And in that light, what Jesus then does on trial is really quite incredible. It's a fascinating account. So I'm going to work through the text. This is, if you've been raised in church or you've been in church for a while, this might be a very familiar text, but I'd like to work through this because I think there's important nuances here that we might miss if we skim over it too quickly. And then at the end of the sermon, I want to do some application work. So I need you to bear with me through the text, and then there's some payoff at the end when it comes to applying this. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get after it. Matthew chapter 27. We're going to pick up where we left off last week in verse 11. Matthew 27, verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor. That's Pontius Pilate. And the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." All right, that's a setup. That's a start. This is the Roman edge of this two-part trial that Jesus is facing. Remember, he has already been found guilty of blasphemy in the religious portion of the trial. He's already been found guilty of being a blasphemer, but the Jewish leaders want Jesus to be executed. They want him dead. And the Jewish authorities were not permitted by Roman law to enact the death penalty. Thus, they bring Jesus before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Okay, now, a Roman trial is different than the trial of the Sanhedrin or the religious trial. A Roman trial would begin with the judge or the magistrate hearing the charges from the accusers. He would hear the charges, and then the judge would give the defendant a chance to speak for himself. So the accused defendant would then defend themselves. And finally, then the judge would retire to chambers with his advisors. They would consider all that they had heard, render a verdict, and then that would be carried out immediately. So there's no jury, okay? There are no lawyers. It's just their word against you, you speaking for yourself, and then whoever the judge is gets to make the decision, and it's gold. Whatever they say goes. So Pilate, in our verses here, verse 11, is giving Jesus the opportunity to defend himself. This is his opportunity to speak on his behalf. Now, it's important to note the charges that were levied against him, because Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That's the charge against him, that he's claiming to be the king of the Jews. But I want you to note, that's brand new right here. That was not the same charge that was levied against him in the religious court. Only in the political court is he being asked that. In the religious trial, they didn't ask, "Are you king of the Jews?" They asked this question, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" So the religious trial is asking one thing, the political trial is asking another thing, because Rome doesn't give a lick if Jesus is a blasphemer against Yahweh. Rome doesn't care about that. Now, the religious leaders absolutely care about that, but Rome doesn't care. They don't care about the Jewish God. And so if they are to bring the charge of blasphemy against Jesus, they're not going anywhere in a Roman court, and so they swing the charges. The religious leaders swing the charges from blasphemy to treason. This is interesting stuff. They don't try the same tactic that they used in the Jewish courts with the Romans. They say he is a man who is committing high treason against the emperor Tiberius. He's claiming to be king. The religious leaders are trying to make it sound like Jesus is plotting sedition against Caesar. That's what they're doing, which is very ironic. It's ironic because Jesus denied that very thing. If you remember back to Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is asked by the ruling leaders, hey, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus famously says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. He's like, pay your taxes, but don't pay homage to Caesar like he is God. But that doesn't sound like a political power grab to anybody. So that's the setup. Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Those are the charges they're levying against you. But Jesus' answer is a bit vague. Does it seem a bit vague to you? It's kind of vague. He doesn't just say no. And he doesn't just say yes. He says, you have said so? Which is like, what judo move was that, Jesus, right? His answer is a bit evasive. And I think it's because while Jesus has never claimed to be king of the Jews, he's never claimed to be king of the Jews, the reality is he is the Messianic king. He's the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. So to say no, he is the King of the Jews. So to say no would be a lie. To say yes would be a lie. And so he just kind of wiggles his way out of that one. But Pilate seems to be aware that Jesus is of no real threat to Rome. He seems to understand this. Jesus is no revolutionary who poses danger to Pontius Pilate's office, nor to the Emperor Tiberius. So that's the setup in verse 11. Now let's look at verse 12. But when Jesus was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to Jesus, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But Jesus gave him no answer, not even a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. So the chief priests accuse Jesus again. But Jesus now, he won't even say, you have said so. He's completely silent. He won't say anything. He will not answer any charge against him, which the text says shocks Pilate. He's kind of like mystified by this. He can't understand why Jesus won't respond to such serious charges. Sedition is punishable by death. Why aren't you speaking up for yourself, Jesus? And by the way, that's the question that remains for us from this account. Why is Jesus silent here? Why does he remain silent, especially when it's so obvious that this trial is a sham? Clearly, the charges against him are made up. One other gospel says they couldn't get people to agree upon what they had seen or heard from him. Jesus wasn't a blasphemer. Jesus wasn't a lawbreaker. He certainly wasn't a political terrorist like they're trying to accuse him of. So why doesn't Jesus, the truth, why doesn't Jesus, the light, why doesn't Jesus, the way, speak up on his behalf for truth, for life? Why doesn't he defend himself? Think about it. If you're watching a courtroom drama, or maybe you're in court yourself, when you stand in a courtroom silent while others make accusation after accusation against you, and then the judge asks, what do you have to say for yourself? You're given that opportunity to speak for yourself, and you say nothing in your defense? What are you conceding in your silence? You're conceding guilt. You're conceding guilt. Jesus stood silently in the face of accusation because he was conceding guilt, friends. But why? Why, you might ask? He wasn't guilty of these charges. So is this untrue of Jesus? Why concede guilt with his silence? But here's what I think we need to see. It was at that moment, as the chief priests accuse him of false charges, that Jesus concedes guilt on a different level. He's conceding guilt in this moment, friends, on a cosmic level. On a cosmic level. Jesus stood silent before that accusation, not because he was pleading guilty to his own sin, but because he was pleading guilty to my sin and to your sin, and in fact to the sins of the whole world. Jesus remains silent because that's what he came to do. He came to take our guilt. So it's a fascinating moment that we can quickly brush over because we know the story. Well, it continues. Look at verse 15. Now, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Okay, another wrench thrown into this kangaroo court of sorts, okay? This wrench thrown into the trial, we find out there's a local custom. This custom of a prisoner release during the Passover festival, which is why we're all here in Jerusalem at this very time. And so Pontius Pilate, as the governor of Judea, had the authority to offer this kind of amnesty to a prisoner, to release a prisoner as a show of good faith during the Passover festival. But here's what you need to know historically what's going on behind the scenes. We know from historical records that Pilate is at this point on very thin ice with the emperor. He is not doing very well in his relationship with Tiberius at this point because there had been a number of riots in Jerusalem under his watch, and it's actually very likely that Pilate was in Jerusalem during this festival to kind of quash or avoid any other sort of riots that might come up from this gathering of tens of thousands of Jews for the festival in Jerusalem. So follow me here. A prisoner release would be a natural sign of goodwill. It'd be a natural sign of goodwill and an immensely strategic political move for Pilate to keep the Jews in line, to keep them from going crazy. And the text says there was a man named Barabbas who fit the bill. What we know about Barabbas from this gospel and other gospel accounts is that Barabbas was a notorious insurrectionist who had committed murder. He was a bad guy as far as we can tell. This means most likely in the context that he was probably a freedom fighter for the Jews from the zealot sort of camp. Remember this, the idea there's Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' 12. The Zealots are more revolutionary. They want to overthrow Rome with the sword. They want to be a bit more aggressive than some of the other factions of the Jews. They try to overthrow the occupying Romans by force. So to Rome's eyes, this guy would have been seen as a murderous terrorist. Like he's a terrorist. Barabbas is a bad guy if you're a Roman, but if you're a Jew, many of you would think this guy's legit. He's a folk hero. He's an ancient Robin Hood. That's who we have in Barabbas. So Pilate probably knows that he can earn some points with the Jews for releasing this guy. Barabbas is likely a winsome character to the mobs. And additionally, the thing that you need to understand is that Barabbas' name is really important to understand. Barabbas is an Aramaic name combining two Aramaic words, bar and abba. Barabbas, Barabba, okay? Bar means son of. So we've seen this in the text, okay? Simon Peter is also called Simon Bar Jonah, Simon son of Jonah. Well, Bar means son of, and Abba means father. So Barabbas literally is son of a father. A more generic name may not have been able to be picked. That'll be important. The son of a father. Verse 17. So, when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" So Barabbas is put next to Jesus Christ. You can picture the scene, the two of them there. Barabbas, the son of a father, is presented next to the son of the Father. One will die. One will be pardoned. You make the decision. Verse 18. For Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they delivered Jesus up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." So two things in these verses to point out. First, the text clearly tells us that Pilate realizes that the accusations against Jesus are coming from accusers who are envious and jealous of Jesus' success. So Pilate knows that this whole thing is the sham. The Bible is clear about that. Pilate knows that Jesus has done nothing to deserve this punishment. But Pilate doesn't want to tick off the Jews. Remember those riots? He does not want another riot on his hands and getting in any deeper with Emperor Tiberius. And what's more, there's this whole business then with this wife of Pilate, her dream, which is a kind of interesting little aside, but Matthew's gospel is unique in this way in showing us that dreams are actually a way that God communicates to someone. Matthew's the only gospel writer who really does this on repeat, where dreams show up as a way of God communicating to someone. He does this uniquely. He does this alone. We find many dreams, okay, especially in the birth narrative. Think of Joseph hearing of Mary's pregnancy through a dream. That only happens in Matthew's gospel. The Magi are warned of Herod in a dream, and so they leave a different direction. That's only in Matthew's gospel. Joseph fleeing with his family to Egypt because of a dream, only in Matthew's gospel. And then Joseph returning a few years later because of a dream, only in Matthew's gospel. See, what I think Matthew's trying to do with this dream sequence is let us know that God is giving Pilate a real life warning. Everyone in this time was superstitious. Everyone in this time, in all cultures, considered dreams from the gods. So Pilate is warned by God about the significance of his action. And his wife says, "This is a righteous man. Have nothing to do with this." Because Pilate's about to judge a truly innocent and righteous man. So it's interesting. Look at verse 20. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. Then the governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you? You got Barabbas, you got Jesus. Who do you want?" And they said, "Barabbas." But Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." Now look at this. This is crazy, y'all. And Pilate said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." Friends, throughout the Gospels, the crowds are almost always on Jesus' side. They're almost always for this messianic king. And even here, they only turn against Jesus because the chief priests and the leaders persuade them to. We saw that. The priests and the elders are manufacturing this entire event. But you can even see in the text that Pilate is wrestling here with justice. I mean, Rome is known for justice. These courts are not meant to be abused like this. And it's very clear that Pilate would still like to free Jesus. He wants him set free because he asks, what evil has he done? What has he done deserving death? And the crowd can't even answer the question. Did you notice that? Because there isn't an answer. They can't answer. All they do, they're in such a frenzy that they work themselves up and shout all the more. You've maybe heard the adage, when in doubt, shout. There it is. When it's unreasonable what you're asking for, just let your voice get a little bit louder and people will start paying attention to you. And they scream, "Crucify him. Let him be crucified." Verse 24. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, the very thing that he could not have happen is happening. But rather a riot was beginning, Pilate took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then they released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. I think the key to those verses, friends, is the riot. I think Pilate probably would have let him go. But a riot was beginning. The very thing Pilate couldn't allow. The very thing that Pilate was actually there to stop. The very thing Pilate would do anything to avoid. And so what Pilate does is he abandons justice, he abandons reason, and he abandons what he knows to be the truth to the whims of the crowd. Pilate's act of washing his hands indicates that he doesn't want anything to do with this. But there's no hint in Matthew's gospel that washing his hands exonerated him. He'd been warned by his wife from a dream. And simply cleaning up his hands does not take the blood off of his hands. His guilt is obvious. One commentator says this: he is no more free of responsibility than Adam when he complained about Eve's sin. Pilate frees the guilty son of a father and proclaims the death sentence to the innocent son of the father. And that's the trial. It's the whole thing. Now, I want us, as we move to application, I want us to remember something that Ryan told us last week when he was preaching. Ryan told us that the Gospels are not only the story about Jesus Christ. Now, they most certainly are, but they're not only the story about Christ, but the Gospels are also a manual for Christians in how we pursue discipleship. So they are a story, but they're also a manual. This story is designed to help form us, Christians, into followers of Jesus. So what does this event teach us, and how does it form us? That's what I'd like to spend the rest of our time today talking about. I think there are three characters in this story, and how their interactions go with Jesus shows us something about ourselves. So here we go. The first character in the story is Pilate. And I'm calling Pilate the indifferent. Pilate the indifferent. What we see in these verses is that Pilate is not actually concerned with whether or not Jesus is king of the Jews. The question at the beginning, are you the king of the Jews? That's not actually what Pilate his greatest concern is in this trial. He's not actually investigating truth. Frankly, he doesn't care what the truth is, which is so ironic if you know John's account, because one of his most famous lines in John's gospel is, "What is truth?" Well, he knows what's true, but he doesn't care. Pilate doesn't care about truth. He doesn't care about justice. I don't think he cares about Rome. He's only concerned with keeping the peace so that he doesn't get in any more trouble with the emperor. Friends, Pilate's main concern is with himself. He's indifferent towards everything else. So remember when I told you that Pilate in this point of his career is on thin ice with Caesar? History tells us, historians tell us that shortly after these events, Pilate actually mishandles another disturbance in the region, and as punishment, the emperor banishes him to Gaul, where he eventually commits suicide. So his end is very similar to Judas's end, in fact. But the point is this: Pilate, friends, was so preoccupied with earthly pressures that he didn't have any time to consider the question of who Jesus actually was. His passivity towards Jesus is because he's so distracted with other circumstances. Y'all, that's not rejection of Jesus, that's indifference to Jesus. And I want to offer that far more people will end up in hell because of indifference and distraction than disbelief. Indifference is probably worse than outright rejection, because at least with the rejection, you're thinking critically about what's going on. With indifference, it's not even worth your time to consider. Pilate represents many of us. Many of us. Pilate represents the husband, too distracted by his career, too engulfed with the cares of his life to give a thought about Jesus. He's just focused on paying bills and parenting and getting kids into the right schools and preparing for retirement. That's Pilate. Pilate maybe is the young man or young woman so focused on getting ahead in their job and their career that church just isn't a priority right now. Or maybe she's so focused on getting married that she doesn't have time to think about these things critically. Pilate's the college student who's so focused on hobbies and fun and what his friends think that he never stops to ask, what have I decided about Jesus? Pilate's the gal who enjoys coming to church. She's into the Bible, she's into spiritual things. She believes in prayer and even likes the worship music. She asks good questions at Bible study. But she never really gets serious about who Jesus is to her. Because that might require too much of a lifestyle adjustment. She's interested in Jesus, but only up to a point. She wants some of the benefits of religion, but that to be a part of her life. She never wants to go full in on that commitment. She's what we would call a fan of Jesus, but not a follower. And I wonder if that's some of us today. You're like, yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm here, right? But when push comes to shove, maybe you're far more indifferent than you are surrendered. The second character after Pilate that I want us to consider is the priests, and I'm calling the priests the religious. The chief priests and the scribes are the religious in this text. The chief priests in ancient Judaism spent their entire lives distinguishing themselves from everyone else. These are the guys who strive for moral perfection. They're experts in the scriptures. They had climbed to the top of the religious ladder, and they're living in ways that they genuinely thought deserved God's blessing. And Jesus, all through the Gospels, on repeat, insults them. He insults their religious pride. Jesus has said that these religious leaders, despite all of their lofty striving and status, are no better in God's eyes than any other sinner. And that they needed to be forgiven just like the tax collectors and the prostitutes. And I'm just telling you, they hated him for saying that. The religious opposition to Jesus is far stronger than anyone else in this chapter. Because when you've spent a whole lifetime trying to set yourself apart as better than someone else that deserves good things, you're going to hate anyone who challenges that. And I think it's true today, friends. Sometimes the greatest resistance to Jesus comes from the religious community. It can come from those who really seem to have their lives all diced up and put into order. And that's because coming to Jesus really coming to him requires abject humility. It requires total surrender that most people, particularly proud religious people, are unwilling to show. Our only hope is to cast ourselves completely and totally on God's grace. To say, I have no hope, not in anything that I could do. I only have hope in your mercy. And I'm just saying most people don't want to do that. Instead, they'd rather play church. Right? They'd focus on just being good people, just being good enough. I follow the rules, I obey, I do some stuff, I'm respectable so that I feel like I've done enough so that I'm good enough to get into heaven. And you couldn't be missing the message of the gospel more than that. Churches today are full of chief priests. but I'm just warning you, they can be difficult to spot. They can be difficult to find because they show up faithfully each week. They know all the words to all the songs. They know exactly when to lift their hands. Sometimes they're on leadership teams. But in their hearts, they've never really reckoned with how sinful they are in God's eyes. In their hearts, they've never fully surrendered themselves without condition or reservation to the mercy and grace of Jesus. So you could be indifferent to Jesus and being here today, but you could also be in here and be religious in how you relate to Jesus, just striving and working and earning, getting right with God by what you do. And that's why Tim Keller famously says that Christianity is actually no religion at all. The gospel is against that type of religion. So in this text, we have the indifferent Pilate and we have the religious priests. And then the final character I want to consider is, of course, Barabbas. And I'm calling Barabbas the ransomed or the redeemed. The ransomed or the redeemed. See, if you're a Christian, the story actually becomes really personal for us in Barabbas. Of all the people in the story that we are supposed to identify with, Barabbas is that guy. Just need you to know that. And you're like, well, I'm not a murderer. Like, I'm not an insurrectionist. So, hey, maybe take it a little easy on us, Pastor. And listen, I hope that's true. Hope you're not a murderer. Hope you're not an insurrectionist, okay? But the point in this text is that Barabbas is rightfully condemned in his sin. The point isn't what Barabbas did. The point is that Barabbas is guilty. He's the guilty one. And friends, the Christian gospel says the same thing about you and about me. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There is no one righteous, no, not one. In fact, okay, you remember in another gospel, the criminals who were crucified with Jesus. Remember this? There's 3 crosses, 2 criminals and Jesus. The word that is used to describe Barabbas is the same word that's used to describe those criminals. So some scholars think that the 3rd cross was actually for the leader of their band, a man named Barabbas. Jesus may have literally bore Barabbas's cross. And that's why I say he's ransomed, because the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. I think we relate to Barabbas in this story more than anyone else because Barabbas is the first in a long line of people who is going to be set free because Jesus died in his place. He's the first one ransomed, friends. Barabbas' story is my story. I'm the guilty son of a father. We are all sons or daughters of a father. That's why I think his name is so generic. He is a generic model of us. We're seeing the entire fate of the human race epitomized in the story of one guy who deserved to die. The guilty man is set free. He is ransomed while the obviously non-guilty son of the father takes his place and is hung on the tree. This is called substitution. And it's essential for us to understand Christian doctrine. Again, Keller has an illustration about this that I'll share. I've shared this before, but I think it's great. Last weekend, I was up in the mountains with my family. And one morning, Eric, Shelley, and I went out and we went to 10 Mile Creek to do some fly fishing. So we went out to go fly fishing. Now, listen, we did not catch any sea monsters that day, but we did get on the trout, all right? So felt pretty good about that. But here's what happens in June as you're fly fishing in the mountain rivers. Because of all of the snow melt off, the flow rates were just cooking, which is great for whitewater rafting, not so good for fly fishing. Just not so great, okay? But I was thinking about that. As I was on the river fishing, I just said, imagine I was walking along the river with my daughter, Harper. And we're walking along 10 Mile Creek, 10 Mile River, and I said, Harper, girl, I love you. I love you so much. You're my only daughter. You're the apple of my eye. And I just want you to know how much I love you, so let me just prove it to you right now. And then I throw myself into the rushing water and die. Imagine I did that. Now, does Harper hold her chest and with tears in her eyes say, oh, how my father must have loved me so? No, absolutely not. That is not a life-changing example of self-sacrificing love. You'd think actually that I was mentally ill if I did something like that. It's in some ways appalling and even offensive to consider that. But imagine the same scenario. I'm walking with my Harper when she accidentally gets a little too close, slips and falls and starts being swept down the wild rapids of the river. And as she struggles, I dive in, I save her, but I'm swept away in the process. See, that's different. Then we'd all say, oh, how he must have loved her. You see, until you understand that you're Barabbas, until you understand that you are dead in the water, that there's no hope for you, that you stood condemned, that third cross was for you, until you understand that, and that the Son of God came to substitute himself as a sacrifice for you, until you understand that, you'll never understand the gospel. But I'm just telling you, like so many of us, when you see that, when you see it, when you really grasp what Christ did for you on the cross, it changes everything. This whole trial, friends, is about us. And I don't think that's right, reading too much into this. This is about me. I was indifferent, just like Pilate, thinking more about the daily trivialities of my life than the eternal realities before me. More interested in what Jesus can do for me than what I owed to him. I was just like him. And I, friends, was religious just like the chief priests, refusing to admit that my utter and complete surrender to his grace and mercy was what was needed. And I'm the guilty one just like Barabbas. In need of being ransomed. In need of being saved. On July 20th of 2012, in the Century Movie Theater in Aurora, 4 young men, all under the age of 30, were at the movies seeing the newest Batman movie, The Dark Knight. And 4 young men under the age of 30 were there with their girlfriends, not their wives, not their mothers, their girlfriends, as they take in a midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises. And 20-some minutes into the movie, a man who had lost his mind, I say that because he pleaded criminally as insane to this event, but a man who had lost his mind popped off a tear gas canister in the theater, lifted up a semi-automatic rifle, and began to randomly shoot in the theater. And all 4 of these young men under the age of 30, with not with moms, not with wives, with girlfriends, all 4 of them grabbed their girlfriends, threw them to the ground, and covered their bodies to protect them. And all 4 young men were shot and killed. You can read about this online if you don't remember the story. All 4 girlfriends survived, though some of them received wounds because it went through the bodies of their boyfriends. But all 4 men were killed and all 4 women survived. And the principle that's been lauded from these 4 young men is the boy goes down so the girl can go free. Why is it that stories like that universally stir us up? Why is that? Because, church, they're shadows and echoes of the greatest story ever told. Friends, Jesus jumped into the river to save you. Jesus laid his body over yours and took the bullets. He went down so that you might go free. He took the 3rd cross that had my name on it, that had your name on it. And that's his voice that might just be stirring in your soul today. He's calling us out of our indifference. He's calling us out of rote religion. He's calling us to be redeemed, to be ransomed, to be set free. This is what the call of Christ is, to follow him, to become his disciple. And that's the invitation to us today that we see in the trial. And next week, friends, we'll finally come to the cross. Let's pray together. Father, when I start to think about these things, it's overwhelming. When I start to think about the great exchange that occurred, not only on the cross, but in all these events leading up to the cross, it stirs within my heart such awe, such reverence, such love, such devotion. It makes me want to live differently. It makes me want to bow the knee to you more. It makes me want to change. And so, Father, as we study a very familiar trial, I'm so thankful that you're always revealing new things to us. Lord, there are some in here who are indifferent to you. Like Pilate, they're more concerned with auxiliary things than they are about really the truth of who you are. And Lord, I pray that scales would fall from some of our eyes if we're indifferent towards you today. Golly, on the other side of the spectrum, there's some who think just because they're here, just because they've been doing this for 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years, that somehow all of that merits favor with you, and that could be further from the truth. Religion won't save us. Lord, the only thing that saves us is to have someone die in our place. To have someone jump in the river, to have someone lay over us and take the bullets for us. And so I'm praying, Lord, that you'd be moving in our hearts right now. To the indifferent, to the religious, and to those who just know that they are not a follower of you. Lord, would you call them? Would you show them your love for them? Would you give them the courage to respond in kind? And Lord, that this would stir up in them such affection for you that you couldn't ever be the same again. Lord, thank you. Oh, how you love us, that you sent your only Son to die in our place. May that change everything. Father, we pray these things in the name of Jesus. and by the power of the Holy Spirit. And all God's people said, amen.